Yeah, ready? Take one.
And I remember one rainy day driving home. And to my right, hundreds and hundreds of cars waiting in line to get on the freeway. To my left, another couple hundred cars waiting to get in line on the freeway. And that's when it struck me.
Let me be clear. UAP are real. Advanced technologies not made by our government or any other government are monitoring sensitive military installations around the globe. Furthermore, the U.S. is in possession of UAP technologies, as are some of our adversaries. I believe we are in the midst of a multi-decade secretive arms race, one funded by misallocated taxpayer dollars and hidden from our elected representatives and oversight bodies.
I had this profound moment, this overwhelming moment where I don't think I've ever felt so alone in my life. I felt like I might as well have been living on the moon. Because even though people were only a few feet away from me and I was surrounded by thousands of cars in bumper-to-bumper traffic, it occurred to me that there wasn't a single human being around me that knew what we were doing and knew the profound implications and the reality of UFOs.
Avant qu'il ne ressente ce vertige au volant, Luis Elizondo était un homme de l'ombre, spécialiste du renseignement, formé à traquer les ennemis invisibles. Terrorisme, contre-espionnage, opérations clandestines. Mais en 2009, tout bascule. Il est convoqué pour un programme secret du Pentagone. Un projet dont même le nom semble incongru, les TIP. Il découvre alors que des objets non identifiés survolent des bases nucléaires, désactivent des missiles, échappant à tout contrôle humain. Ce n'est pas de la science-fiction, mais des faits, mesurés, enregistrés, validés par les meilleurs pilotes de l'armée américaine. Mais l'immobilisme des officiels lui est insoutenable. Face à l'inertie des autorités, Elizondo décide d'agir. En 2017, il démissionne et choisit la voie médiatique. Ces révélations provoquent une onde de choc dans les plus hautes sphères du gouvernement et bien au-delà. De quel secret Luis Elizondo était-il le gardien ? Retour sur une histoire aux résonances historiques qui pourrait bien bouleverser le cours du monde.
I do believe it was a sense of duty that really motivated me to come forward and go public about the reality of UAPs and that my government has for decades been investigating this incredible enigma, perhaps in an attempt to answer the age-old question of humanity, and that is, are we alone? If you were to ask myself and my colleagues that question, I think there's a definitive answer. We are certainly not alone. It wasn't until 2009 that I was asked to be part of a program that I'd never heard of before. And frankly, if you had asked me back then, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But I was asked to be part of a program that studied unidentified aerial phenomenon, or in the vernacular, UFOs. The name of the program was called ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And I remember this meeting very specifically. After several meetings over the course of a few weeks with some people, some representatives from that office, I was finally invited to go and speak to its director. His name was James Lakatsky. And by the way, he was probably the premier rocket scientist at the time for the United States government. And it was there I learned the truth. I remember in one meeting with him, he looked at me straight in the eyes. He looked over his glasses and he said, "What do you think about UFOs?" And I thought for a moment and I responded truthfully. I said, "I don't." And he looked at me kind of quizzically and he said, "What do you mean you don't believe in UFOs?" And I said, "No, that's not what you asked me. You asked me, what do I think about them?" And I responded truthfully, "I don't think about them because I don't have the luxury to think about them. I'm too busy, chasing terrorists and spies and things like that." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, that's fair. That's a fair response, Lou, but let me just give you some advice here. Don't let your analytic bias get the best of you, because what you may learn may challenge any preconceived notions you may have about the topic." And he was absolutely right. probably if you were to ask me 10 years ago, well, probably if you were to ask me 15 years ago by now, what I would have thought about this project, ATIP, the Pentagon's program looking at UFOs, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And it wasn't until that I actually was part of the program to run the counterintelligence and security for it initially before I became in charge. That's when I realized what was going on. What I find very intriguing was the overall scale and scope of this problem. This wasn't just a U.S. mystery that was happening here in the United States. This was happening globally. And it was happening with our international allies and partners. They were experiencing these UFOs, but no one wanted to say anything. And we also had information, intelligence information, that suggested very heavily that our adversaries, foreign adversaries, also were heavily invested in this topic, and they too were experiencing these UAP, these UFOs, over their sensitive military installations and over their nuclear facilities. And so I think at that point, most of us realized in the program that this was truly a global phenomenon and not just a US-only phenomenon. A lot of people have asked me, what is the best case that I've ever seen for a UFO? And for me, my response is it's like picking a favorite child. They're all different and they're all unique and they're also very, very compelling. For example, I've seen videos where these UFOs are now think about this, 15 feet away from the cockpit.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
We have other videos, long videos, 23 minutes in length in some cases, where these UFOs, these UAP, seem to come in and interrogate some of our intelligence collection platform. When you look at it, you realize this is something that is not ours. This is not made by a human. Then you have other cases where material was recovered, right? And you can actually test the metals. You have other cases where there were biological samples recovered. We had lots. In fact, I'll share with you, we had in a course of 1 month, 30 days, involving the USS Roosevelt and the carrier fleet, we had over 28 separate UFO incidents involving that carrier group in 1 month alone.
Très vite, Luis Elizondo réalise la portée du phénomène. Il croit pouvoir faire bouger les lignes à force de rapports précis, indiscutables. Dans ce genre d'histoire, on s'attend parfois à un ennemi venu d'ailleurs. Un vaisseau, une altérité radicale. Mais parfois, l'adversaire porte costume et cravate.
I had spent several years trying to get senior management in the Department of Defense and at the CIA and in the intelligence community to pay attention to what was going on, what our findings were. And it wasn't easy because we were being given money by Congress and spending money to study UFOs and figure out what these things were and how they operated, but no one wanted to know. There was this, I guess the social stigma and taboo was so great that they were happy with us doing what we were doing, but they didn't really want to do anything about it. Meanwhile, I'm getting emails and messages coming in on a daily basis from the fleet. And one of them I'll never forget. It literally said, hey, I've got these things, these UFOs all over my ship, and I cannot keep people below deck forever. What do you want us to do? And so I kept going up to the head of the front office of the Secretary of Defense and meeting with his 3 principal staff assistants and briefing them. And I had the pilots come in and I had the radar operators come in and we had the videos and the reports and the investigations and yet they still did not want to brief the Secretary of Defense on this topic. Now, I happen to have a little insight on the Secretary of Defense at the time because I served with him in Afghanistan early on in 2001, and then later on in the Middle East. And I've always known Secretary Mattis, or at the time General Mattis, to be an excellent combat leader. And this is a person that always wants more information, not less. And his own staff did not want to brief him on what was happening. And I suspect there's several reasons for it, but at the end of the day, I realized the only way I was going to get the boss's attention, the only way I was going to get the secretary's attention was for me to resign. We have this code of ethic in national security. If you can't fix a problem internally, you don't stay and make the problem worse. You do the right thing and you leave. And then you can say whatever you want, but you definitely don't do anything disruptive or destructive while you're in uniform. And so for me, I realized the only way I was going to be able to get the boss's attention, the secretary's attention, is by resigning in protest and addressing my resignation letter directly to the secretary himself. And that's exactly what I had to do. And the rest, you might say, is history.
Face à une élite muette, il se rend à l'évidence. La population mérite la vérité. Alors, pourquoi ce silence? Et surtout, à qui profite-t-il? S'agit-il d'un échec démocratique ou d'une divulgation lente et contrôlée?
Chris Mellon and I, a colleague of mine, Chris Mellon, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a very senior staffer on the Hill at one point, he recognized that we needed a plan of attack. If we wanted this to be successful, we had to run this disclosure almost like you would an intelligence or a military campaign. And so we realized, first and foremost, we needed legislative engagement. We needed to engage the members of Congress so they could take this topic seriously, they could see the information for themselves, and then they could pass laws and requirements, because in our country, Congress controls the budget, they control the money. But we also knew, because we have another branch of government here called the executive branch, among the three branches that we have, the executive branch was also equally important because they are the ones that are executing the will of Congress. So we had to engage Congress, legislative engagement. We had to engage the executive branch. So the military departments and agencies, the intelligence community and the CIA and whatnot. But we also had to have international engagement, because we realized early on this was not just a US only phenomenon. This was something that we were seeing globally. So we had to engage our international partners and allies, and that includes facilitating a situation where you have maybe bilateral information sharing agreements and intelligence exchanges between two countries specifically on this topic. The fourth, if you will, pillar of engagement is media engagement. Because if the media gets involved, that's going to encourage Congress and the executive branch to take this topic more seriously. Now, keep in mind, the media for a very long time was very risk averse. This topic would have been considered career suicide for any respectable journalist. Now, this topic has become certainly more easily discussed amongst the general public. And the last, if you will, pillar of engagement here, column of engagement, which is probably singularly the most important, which is public engagement. Getting the general public involved, because that will then embolden the media to cover this topic. It will also embolden Congress, as their constituents demand, to cover this topic. So we needed to do all five, and we needed to do all five at the same time, but they weren't all, we couldn't engage them equally. We had to engage them separately and differently. Why? Because the public, for example, the general public doesn't have a security clearance. So we can't have a classified discussion with the general public. We can't provide classified information. With the media, it's very much the same thing. When people ask me, what did I expect from all this? I couldn't tell you. This had never been done before. I was told by several very close friends of mine that this was a recipe for disaster, that we stood less than a 1% chance of success, and that we were going to find ourselves in a lot of trouble. And that was true. I think both were true. I think we did have less than a 1% chance of success, and somehow we have succeeded. And we also got into a lot of trouble. We upset a lot of people, both inside our government and in other organizations, particularly within our military-industrial complex. But I believe that I believe the truth shall set you free. I believe sometimes that sunlight is the best antiseptic. If you want to get rid of an infection, I think Sometimes you have to provide sunlight, transparency. There are some people in my government that believe secrets are like a fine wine, where the longer you keep a cork on it, the better it gets. I disagree with that. I think secrets are like vegetables in your refrigerator. I think they're perishable. I think they have a shelf life. And if you keep them too long, just like vegetables in the refrigerator, they will begin to rot and they'll begin to stink, and then you have a really big mess on your hands. I think there's a lot of historic reasons, and some of them are probably good reasons, why the United States has kept this conversation secret for so long. I think when you look at when we really, as a government and as a country, began to really experience a spike in UFO, UAP activity, it was really right at the end of World War II. We started to see some of it. The Allies would report these things as Foo Fighters over the European theater of war, but really it started to ramp up right after we entered the atomic age. And if you look at where the United States was at the time, we were at the height of the Cold War with Russia, then Soviet Union, and it was kind of this winner-takes-all mentality. Society can't handle it. People can't handle the truth. That was the mindset of countries involved in UFO investigations. So I think there were three fundamental reasons why governments did not want to have this conversation openly. One is to make sure you don't advertise what your vulnerabilities are and maybe what you know and what you don't know about something. Maybe your adversaries have more insight than you. Another one is to make sure that you don't get additional scrutiny from Congress and the American people about a topic that right now you can't protect the American people from. And then number three is that maybe there's this crisis of conscience, maybe that people aren't ready yet to handle the truth. Let me share something with you that I've only just now started sharing publicly. My father, in my book, Imminent, I discuss my mother's death, which was a very profound moment for me. My father died more recently. My father died 2 years ago on Father's Day. And to the day he died, he never told me he was sick. But I knew he was sick. I could tell. The last few times I saw him, I could tell that time was limited. And so I was honored and privileged to have, about 2 months before he passed away, time with him to drive from where I live in Wyoming all the way to South Florida. It was about a 4-day car drive. And I think somewhere halfway through the trip, I asked my father a question. I said, "Dad, in your opinion, what is the greatest threat to humanity?" Now I'm thinking to myself, is it maybe some sort of a pandemic, like a virus? Maybe it's terrorism or something like nuclear war. And he looked at me and he said, "Son, the greatest threat to humanity is corruption." And I thought about it for a minute. I said, "Corruption? That's odd, like financial corruption?" He said, "No, son, any corruption. Corruption is the act of giving away one of your core values in exchange for something else. And when you do that, whether it's religious corruption, moral corruption, financial corruption, governmental corruption, when you do that in the government, you start chipping away at the very foundation of democracy. And it's a very quick and slippery slope from that to total tyranny. It's always an internal threat. It's always ourselves. We get lackadaisical, we get selfish, we get greedy. And every time we compromise on a core value in the government, we start chipping away. And why this topic, I think, it's problematic is because there have been people making decisions in the past that frankly were illegal. There were people that were making decisions not to brief certain presidents, not to brief certain members of Congress, even though they are supposed to do it. They have to, they're by law. That's very dangerous, especially in a democracy, especially in a free society. Nothing good comes from that. And so that's one of the motivations that led me to go public with this topic. I think there's a real fear by my country that another country will be first to reverse engineer completely and understand this technology. That's problematic. You can imagine if there was a rogue nation like North Korea that's been very provocative, having this technology, or Iran. So the question people have is, well, then it's one of two options. Do we have disclosure or do we not? Well, I don't think it's only two options. I think there's a third option. There's a middle road where you can disclose the fact that we're not alone in the cosmos without necessarily disclosing the specific capabilities and secrets about how these things operate. Look, it's no secret that North Korea, for example, has atomic weapons and missiles that are armed with atomic weapons. What might be secret is how they work, how they operate, what their flight path is. So it's not an either or. I don't think we need to necessarily say either we tell the truth or we don't say it at all. I think we can have the discussion without necessarily compromising national security equities. But it's not easy, because in order to do that, we first have to understand what are those equities that we're trying to protect, right? And what are the capabilities of certain adversarial countries. And so that takes a lot of cooperation and coordination to make sure that whenever you have a conversation like this, we're not giving away secrets that could have significant consequences on our national security.
Si ces objets existent bel et bien, et si leur capacité dépasse les nôtres, alors une question se pose. Qui sont les êtres qui pour l'heure semblent se cacher derrière un phénomène polymorphe et insaisissable? Sont-ils une menace pour l'humanité?
So often I'm asked a question, why are they here? And if they're so technologically advanced, what interest could they possibly have with Earth and, more importantly, us? And there's all sorts of reasons why something might be interested in human beings. Look, we have an entire field of study called sociology, where humans study other human beings because we're fascinating creatures. We are an incredibly complex creature from an emotional perspective. And yet we're also very, very simple. It could also be that maybe we're just a gas station. Perhaps that we do know that there is an interest with UFOs with water. Is it possible that they're using water? Maybe they're separating the oxygen from the hydrogen. They're using the hydrogen as some sort of fuel, and we're just simply a gas station, an Esso station, right? Or is it something far more profound? Is it possible they've been here all along? Now people say, well, that's silly. Well, is it really? We now realize through our understanding of quantum physics that the universe is far more complex than we've ever considered before. So I think if there's one lesson we need to learn as humanity, is hubris is the enemy. Pretending that we think we know everything. If there's one thing that we get right, is the fact that we're usually wrong the first time, and even the second time. That's probably how I would answer that question when someone says, why are they interested in us? They might not be interested in us, or they could be very interested in us, or it could be a combination of both. Because people say here, well, we are aware of incidents where UFOs have disarmed, disabled our nuclear warheads. And that's true, but in Russia, there's incidents of them turning them on, right? Furthermore, in 1945, when we dropped bombs, 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, where we vaporized 500,000 living souls off this planet, nowhere did UFOs intervene. In fact, when we went from atomic technology to nuclear technology, nowhere did these UFOs intervene.